Thank you so much, Dave. That's great. Thanks for the stereotypical introduction. I'll try not to disappoint. At first I thought I was going to have some sort of Jimmy Kimmel sort of version, so I thank you for that. It's very, very respectful and quite sophisticated. So I'm the lifeguard tower guy. Okay, great. Listen, welcome everybody, and I think we have about an hour. I won't take quite that long, because I love to both get into some discussions about some of the things I say, because most of it is untrue, partially made up, and what I felt like saying this morning, so you'll probably have ample opportunities to challenge me on most of that. Quick sort of full disclosure piece in terms of transparency, and it might deeply disappoint many of you, and probably even offend some, is that I am not a technical person. That's not my background. I'm not an engineer or a scientist. But I did, thankfully, spend a good chunk of my life involved in threats, preventing it, not causing them. But as a result, I did learn a lot, and I'm very much a people person, because I believe ultimately, and you'll see during the presentation, that this is an issue around technology. It's a technological challenge, absolutely. But in my view, it's mostly, though, it's a people challenge. It's something to do with the human being factor that's related to all of this. Okay, so let me walk through a couple of thoughts just to sort of, again, engage the discussion. I'm going to quickly go through a number of visuals, mostly because, again, I'm hoping you won't be able to challenge me on some of the factoids I'll be throwing out there, so I'll go very quickly, and I talk fast too, so all that combined should make for a great combo. I'll walk you through the idea that ultimately we have created something most significant, and we are exploiting it at max capacity, max velocity. Almost to the point where I think, as some have warned recently, and I think some people who are generally thought of as being very thoughtful and not prone to hyperbole have said we should be somewhat cautious with respect to what we create. And Bill Gates is another voice of late talking about that. Some of the reasons are is that, well, in my view, again, somebody who's been around government circles for 30 years, I've briefed ministers about threats for the last couple of years in my last position at CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And I also, just so you know, too, in terms of context, I spent most of my life in counterterrorism. But in the last few years as the head of intelligence, that is the organization, or part of the organization that had to figure out what we knew and, more importantly, what we didn't know, I realized how much technology, the internet and cyber was transforming the world and the world the way we saw it and transforming the nature of the threat. And I saw that because, well, ultimately there was a gap. There was this huge, huge gap developing around things we're able to do as human beings in terms of knowledge, creativity, innovation, but we also were lacking some of the intent in terms of why are we doing the things we're doing and what is the ultimate outcome. So derivatives come to mind, and the 2008 financial explosion that we're still dealing with today is probably a great example of that incredible innovation that was created without thinking it through. But it actually goes beyond that. I think artificial intelligence, I think high-speed trading as part of the other piece I've already seen is also a big chunk of that equation. Gene splicing and the whole genome project, as well as the issue of nanotechnology in terms of things. And again, the promise is exceptional, but managing the risk could prove more difficult than we think. Part of the world that we see, at least the one that I observe, and I want to sort of offer it a bit as part of my overriding premise, is that there's a huge, huge area of divide between what we do knowledge-wise and what we want to govern in terms of policy. I grew up in the height of that post-World War II environment that had significant unipolar leadership, despite the Soviet Union and the United States involved in a Cold War. There was certainty. There were rules of engagement. There were, from the financial system around the IMF, a number of things that were very, very clear. That is no longer the case. There are no, for example, when dealing with the internet, there are no covenants, there are no agreements, there are no treaties. Carl Bildt, the former Swedish Prime Minister, just had a release, I think it may be coming out today, or maybe it was released last night, I just got an advanced copy, on an effort to create almost a... I didn't do anything. Are we okay? Yeah, anyway, try to create a statement of principles around the internet. And that's the first good thing. I went back to a couple of journalists yesterday and said, good, but I had a couple of exceptions to what he said. But anyhow, it's the first attempt to see something like that happen. All right, so let's, as I'm apt to do being a threat guy, and my wife accuses me of always being involved in the fear industry and profiting from it, but I do believe that ultimately to understand all the good things that happen in life, you do have to look at the bad. I'm not a nuclear physicist, as I stated at the outset. I know nothing except I read. And I read about the Hadron Collider a few years ago. It was built in 2008. And they're talking about it took 100,000 scientists in 100 countries, and they built something that's 27 kilometers long. It has enough energy stored in the magnets to equal about 2.5 thousand tons of TNT buried in one small space. And then they're going to crash particles together to create something they're not even too sure what it is. I don't know, I'm not an expert, but I'm thinking something really bad came out of that. So as a result, these are one of these sort of early examples, although most people sort of say, listen, there's lots of naysayers, there's always reasons not to engage in science, and there's always reasons to manage risk effectively. I hope and I pray that that is one of the examples of well-managed risk, because smart people are doing what they do. But when they have one of their unclear outcomes is to create a thing called strangelets, which they're not even sure, outside of particle theories, is that they're not sure exactly what it is, that it may be uncontrollable, and a black hole may emerge and destroy the universe as we know it. Otherwise, it's good R&D. Another great example I came across recently, and this involves a Canadian, so I thought I couldn't pass up this example. 2009, it was in May, a Canadian scientist was on his way from Manitoba to a job in Maryland at the National Institute of Health. And he decided to take along with him 22 vials. Oh, I forgot to say, he was also one of the leading researchers in HIV and AIDS. So he packed up in the trunk of his car, wrapped up in an old glove and a small plastic bag, 22 vials of very, very toxic material that was previously in Canada's Level 5 top secret security research lab, and decided to drive him to Maryland with him to take on his new job because he didn't want to have the trouble having to recreate all of his research. So again, the unintended consequences of certain things can be very, very real. But then there's this piece here that really gives me the shivers. And you'll probably recognize the incident, but I'm going to give you an alternative hypothesis. Anybody recognize this?
Staying.
Absolutely. Now, when I saw this, I was still working at CSIS, and my first thought was, it's finally happened. A terrorist organization is finally able to hack into the SCADA system, take control of a high-speed train, as they threatened to do, and then crash it off the rails. As it turns out, it was the act of one person. And I'll come back to the theme of unintended consequences, because it's the unpredictable nature of what one individual can do because they're empowered by technology. Here's another fearsome example, I think, that shook up the world, because we all fly. All of us use air transportation as one of our principal modes to get around. And as somebody who believes in the theory I call the democratization of power, we have one individual who takes upon himself to probably transform aviation the way we know it. 9/11 did the first round, he's just done round 2. So now we've built the door, but now we've got to find a way to also ensure that we have a cabin crew that we can trust. Hence my point all the time about technology versus humans and how we have to find that proper balance. Another little piece of this isolated but connected in disproportionate power is the example we've seen from the Syrian Electronic Army, and more recently a group saying they're affiliated with ISIS and the Caliphate and so on. Now they took down TV5, which is one of the larger broadcasters around the world. I think they hit a little over 100 countries. Took down all 11 stations for a good chunk of the day. Now, it may be a small group of people somewhere in Syria or Iraq with very limited connectivity, or it's affiliated persons outside who are just simply globbing together and congregating to create an event and to support a cause. And that increasingly seems to be part of the threat landscape. Now, back in terms of looking, let's just step back and take a look at the larger piece around the economy. The internet has changed everything, and it has empowered us. It has created incredible wealth and knowledge, but exponentially because of the Internet of Things, where the economy is supposed to, well, according to Cisco, produce about a $19.5 trillion boost to the economy. We're going to see probably, the figure's not there, about 60 billion devices connected to the Internet by 2020. The Cisco CSO was at an event I was speaking at as well in Toronto about a few weeks ago. He said, I think the 60 billion figure is way off. It's going to be far more than that. So of course what we've also created now, and we're increasingly moving towards an area where the threat landscape is huge. Therefore, the opportunity for threat actors becomes very, very significant. There's also another part. We have to look at this thing both in two sides. I always like to look at things in the potential reverse onus. And in this, we have the societal factors. And let's go back to my example about 2008 and the big impact of the financial crash. The baby boomers, Gen X's, Gen Y or millennials and others, they take a very different view. When I was the Director General of Counterterrorism at CSIS, that was what, 2009 to 2011, 86% of my officer group or my staff were less than 2 years of service. That meant they were all millennials. It was the best job I ever had. They were engaged, they were networked, they were creative, they were innovative, but they were very rules challenged, and I get that. But we liked it to the maximum capacity because they weren't also stymied or sort of short-sighted because of rules. But of course, in the context of the internet, there are no rules existing, and the ones that are currently sort of shaping a little bit of the construct around the internet is very malleable and very, very flexible. The other issue too, of course, is globalization. We're at a point now where everything's disrupted. The world economy is disrupted. We feel it. We all have friends, relatives. I have 2 sons who just graduated from university, still looking for work. So globalization has large long-term effects, and of course it's part of that destabilization which creates opportunity or threats with respect to the internet. And of course we have this situation where there's been some social upheaval. I suspect if the economy gets worse, if the European economy continues or goes back into a slowdown, or if the American economy slows down, we'll see much more of that. Again, I think the pathways of reaction though will be through the internet and less of the street. And of course, it's that 99 versus 1%, where 1% of the population has such disproportionate power. It speaks mostly to the have and have-nots around technology. Those who are empowered by the knowledge and those who cannot and will continue to struggle. And I think we will see that growth exponentially over the next number of years in terms of that division of society. Now, the Snowden effect. I don't judge Edward Snowden. Some of you might. Hero or chump, for this example or discussion, it matters not. Except though I think he's really earned the reputation of being the ultimate insider. So he redefined insider threat. Great for business, great for what other people do, I'm sure, in terms of your industries, or companies you work for within this industry. But at the end of the day, he has had a big impact on the way the internet will emerge over the next few years. He's certainly been very good at awareness, raising awareness and helping people understand that given an intent, given sufficient resources, organizations will solve technical challenges. And that includes getting at data and getting at personal information wherever it may reside. You probably know much better than me that passwords are just really a matter of a question of time and money. And of course, that's part of the dilemma that he's introduced. The big immediate impacts, though, has been on the economy. There are numbers of American firms, I know, some Canadian as well, who've lost business opportunities because of this reshaping of the internet through the Snowden disclosures. And of course, the threat actors. I was at a Five Eyes intelligence conference last year in LA. I'm going back again in a couple weeks. And I know from my discussion with my former colleagues is that the lights in the ears, the lights have gone out and the ears have gone deaf in a lot of areas, and that will cause significant impacts on the threat landscape with respect to counterterrorism. But let's take the Snowden effect at a more of a macro level, and when I look at the outcomes, what we've seen already is a new approach to data segmentation and data sovereignty. Countries from Germany to Brazil and others are making very clear noises. Russia and China are making very clear moves to segregate the internet and manage it at a national level versus an international thing, and which one up until now has been American-led, which I think my lucky stars every day, because it'll be a very, very different internet in a few years' time because of that. The other factor is that we're moving very rapidly to encryption, an age of encryption. It's driven for economic reasons, and service providers are saying ultimately the biggest threat is, as one of the larger Canadian companies have told me recently, most who provide security for different big banks and others said, the most important question I get these days is, how do I keep American intelligence and police agencies out of my data? So of course that's causing some big ripple effects all through the ability to do business and the way that, I guess, agencies shortly will be able to get at people's data even in a lawful context. And I'll come back to that theme in a moment. The weaponization of the internet in terms of warfare, fifth dimensional battle space, is upon us. And we've seen many examples from Target store, well, sorry, I should say that, Home Depot, I think the NASDAQ hack, JP Morgan Chase may be part of that little flavor as well, where nationalism meets nation-state objectives, meets criminal organized groups. And not only are they now working in a permissive environment, but now they're also being told, go forward and disrupt Western business. So that's been another effect, and they've been empowered by the revelations from the Stone factor. I think it factored very much into the calculations of Putin on Ukraine and Crimea, and also with respect to other sort of moves they're making in terms of deals and leveraging the relationships with Iran and a number of countries. So ultimately, though, it affects, I think, and the image on the top right is really just to represent Western hegemony. The West has led the world for about 600 years, and we have taken such a massive hit on the most important part of our knowledge piece, which was our security of our data and the ability to manage security and warfare through internet operations. And that has been greatly revealed by Ed Snowden. Now, if you accept my premise that there's been a shift, there's been this democratization of power, there's a great level of empowerment of people, there are some pros in that are significant, and I think they're good. So a couple quick examples. MH370, one of those things that fascinates everybody to this day. Where is that aircraft? How did it happen? Who's behind it? Has it been hijacked? Well, one of the groups that's actually leading research in a serious way is basically a crowdsourced organization of retired scientists, engineers, former pilots, and they use all of those open source tools, all that OSINT, to drive the investigation. And they're constantly pestering and hammering away at authorities to go after the next lead. Fantastic. I think that's a great transitional piece. The Boston Marathon had an early hint of that, where crowdsourcing really helped law enforcement to get through those hundreds of terabytes of data from videos and visual images from the area. And of course, a couple other things, those guys blundered quite a bit as well, which made it very easy for a law enforcement conclusion. But the crowdsourcing piece was the early days of seeing that shift in interest in the public in pursuing things. The perhaps negative side, unintended consequences, follow up through a couple things. Corporate espionage as a managed service, malware as a managed service, and of course Stuxnet as the alternate weapon. And this is where I've often chided some of my former colleagues. What is a great intelligence tool today is tomorrow's exploit. And that's where we know I think there's about a half a dozen variants already out in the wild built around the Stuxnet construct. And that is very troubling. Hence my video on the train piece. We're not far off. Israel's had a couple of events where where that cyber attacks take control of the light control system in the tunnel. There's a number of things that are just early days. Germany, nuclear reactor attack last year. There's the things that start to indicate where the threat actors are moving, and of course that's where this consequential piece around the empowerment. There's another sort of after effect of Snowden, and another reflection of the new environment is that we have a current conflict, and it's moving front and center fairly rapidly. You've seen the stories, you've heard the talk, you've heard the FBI Director James Comey say, listen, we have a need for lawful access, and we need to get at emails, we need to get at data that threat actors are moving around the universe. I've often used this example. There's a lot of debate in Canada as well around lawful access. We have failed legislation that couldn't get past Parliament because of the sudden groundswell of opposition. And I made the analogy, and I was testifying in front of Parliament, and I said, when I first started the business, I had two tools. I had my car, so I had a set of car keys, and I had a phone call. And I had a cheater that basically find addresses. Why? Because threat actors were all about what kind of vehicles they moved in and where they lived or worked or associated with others. And that took us right up until around the year 2000. Now threat actors travel through this. And this is their mode of transportation. It's about IP address, and it's about registered owners in terms of registration, in terms of the cell providers. That's the reality of today. And hence the very clear warning by the security establishment telling all the service providers, whom I like to call now the sixth estate, because they themselves are becoming influencers in our debates and in our public discourse around security and around the way we manage our lives. Because they have, of course, a private commercial interest in succeeding there, but they also have, to get disproportionate influence because of how ubiquitous the technology is around Google and Apple and Microsoft and others. So let's just pause for a second and just sort of recap on the idea that, yes, the internet is an awesome development that I benefited from the early days from my first Atari computer in the sense of being a user, not a technical person. It has created wealth that we enjoy at this very moment, and it's surpassed every conceivable notion when the internet was first commercialized back in the mid-90s. It has increased the level of knowledge 1,000-fold in terms of people's access. The things we do every day when we're sitting at the table or having a chat with friends and family, and somebody says something, somebody's got their phone out and searching the answer. I mean, that is stuff that we just take for granted, but didn't exist very long ago. The problem, of course, is that out of all that good, there's the opportunity for a very negative, malicious activity. And again, as I said earlier, that threat surface is expanding at a very, very rapid rate because we never think about the security piece. We're always thinking about, one, the productivity about the tool, and secondly, the fun factor in terms of whatever pleasure we can get out of those devices. Let me now turn back to what I like most, threats, and give you a couple examples of the abyss, because I talked about the idea that ultimately, as the title infers, I want to walk you through the big strategic piece, talk about, are we really at the edge of the abyss, as you probably think I'm leaning towards very solidly, or perhaps there's a turning point. Some of you probably don't remember the guy on the left, Ted Kaczynski. He was arrested in 1995. He was the Unabomber. Brilliant guy. He got his PhD at the age of 25, teaching math. He was one of the early persons, though, in his early writings as an undergrad at Harvard. I think he was admitted at the age of 16. He was one of those guys who started raging against the machine, against technology, progress, industrialization, and so on. Well, he single-handedly took on a campaign that led to the most expensive manhunt in FBI's history. So he was that first early embodiment of this democratization of power, the ability of one person to disrupt society or to communicate a message very, very loudly. The other guy holding the weapon is a guy named Anders Breivik, and he committed an attack in Norway in the summer of 2011, and I was still at CIS at the time, and I went to see the Norwegians a little while after. I was doing a Northern European tour, and talking to them, I said, there's no way that one guy was able to execute successfully a complex attack like that. 2 different explosions in Oslo, moved off to an island, made his own police uniform, and killed 69 young people, all children of the Labour Party, the governing party's children at a summer camp. Incredible traumatization of society. Up until just a year or so ago, I have a good friend who's still in Norway, she said, this country has not gotten over the impact of Anders Breivik. So that democratization of power can be not just through the internet, but can be with a very, very low-tech set of weapons, IEDs and handguns. But then if you go back to the internet, we see the issue of ransomware, and we see the ability increasingly to lock down people's data and lock down corporations' data. We're definitely not that far off, I would suggest, in locking down air traffic control system at a very, very busy airport, or perhaps the nuclear control system at a station. A number of things can happen despite our best efforts. When a company like JP Morgan Chase spends $250 million on security, cybersecurity, on the same year they were hacked, speaks well to this issue that we need to be resilient. We have to continuously build on resilience, but there's no guarantee of optimum security. And I think that equation is increasingly tipping towards the realization that the advantage always goes to those who are the attackers. Here's a little example again of something goes back. This is another Canadian example. This is a controlled explosion by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, the guys with the red surges and the really cute caps. This was based on ammonium nitrate that they'd seized in Toronto in 2006. Now in May 2006, you may have heard the reference to a group called the Toronto 18. Toronto 18 were homegrown jihadists. Most of them were born in Canada. Most of them came from other parts of the world at a very, very young age. Anyhow, long story short, they had a series of plots to seize Parliament, behead the Prime Minister, and when they were arrested, they were taking possession of this much ammonium nitrate, which was about 2.5 times the size of what the Oklahoma City bombing had in 1995. that destroyed the Edward Murrow building. And that was parked that truck was supposed to be parked right downtown Toronto on Front Street in the heart of the financial district. It's a part of Toronto that probably produces about 6-7% of the country's GDP per day. And that place would have been unlivable for decades, and not just a few hundred people, because the Murrow building was interesting the way the blast went, because of course it was open space. Anybody knows anything about blast, the rolling effect really amplifies in a large urban setting. Where this bomb would have gone off at 60, 70, 80-story skyscrapers, the impact of that blast would have been catastrophic. And that was involving basically down to 4 guys with a plane. So now that I've really got everybody deeply depressed, I'm going to work towards something a little bit more cheerful, but, well, I think there is a turning point, and I think we are there. When I first started talking about this business a few years ago, when I first left the service, even before, I remember going out and speaking to some CEOs of some companies, because I was working for the director, and I approached him and said, I know our mandate doesn't allow us to do this, but there are some iconic Canadian companies that are being devastated by cyber. And that means our future prosperity, that of our children, are being compromised at a tremendous rate. So we agreed. We went out and talked to some companies and told them. Of course, it's one of those classic things. I walked up or make an appointment, sit down, have lunch with one CEO, and said, listen, you're being devastated. So I gave him a couple of details. He looks at me and goes, well, who is it? What can I do? So I kind of looked at him and said, well, I don't know if you can say, I'm from government. You don't really think I'm here to help you. So I can't tell you anything. This is all top secret. I can't tell you who, I can't tell you how they're doing it, but just the fact that be aware that you're being done. So I realized that there was a need to change things. There was a need to sort of share more intelligence and share more information. Hence one of the reasons I left. I thought I got to find some way to be able to share knowledge a bit more readily. So in those first days, though, walking out the first few months, there was, I found there was a lot of disbelief. I think there was a lot of I guess, willful blindness. It's probably the best way to put it. I think a lot of CEOs and others. Tenure of a CEO today is what, about 3.5 years? And a couple of times, I have to admit, when I was talking and explaining what I think is happening to their industry, what I think is going on with respect to their company, and a few things, where I think back when I was doing a briefing at the service, I could only see in their eyes, it's kind of like, listen, if you can just keep your mouth shut for another year and a half, everything's good. Because my stock valuations are right off the scale. And if you don't get in the way, I'll be a happy, successful guy or gal. So as a result, I think there's a bit of that. Now I'd say in the last 18 months, things have really changed. This in itself was one of those first, most important single points of awakening. And I think this quote resonated with a lot of CEOs. I've had this discussion a few times, and I think this is what caught their attention. Because even though 2014 was considered the year of the hack, 2015 appears to be named the year of destruction and about data destruction, and the NASDAQ hack was a really good example of that. So I think this caught their attention, and I've had a lot more discussions at the C-suite. In fact, invited to more briefings, and the same for this group. I think in terms of boards of directors and others, they're really starting to pay attention because the issue of liability has now crept into their lexicon, and they're thinking about this. And of course, the statistics prove that out, where they feel basically only about half of them, that they think themselves at the C-suite level or at the board level, they're actually thinking, we're good, we're in good shape. So I think that in itself is asking yourself questions. As you know, from my old business, I always thought that the moment we are complacent is the moment we will die. We will lose an officer, we'll lose an asset somewhere in Yemen or in Afghanistan, wherever the case may be. But as soon as we think we're good, we're so good that nobody's going to touch us, is the moment you're going to fail. And I think that's being that consistently uncomfortable is the best place to be in terms of cyber defense. The other reason that it's driving this home, and I think this is where the marketplace is always a great thing, because insurance will be one of the biggest drivers for change. But let me first talk to the privacy piece. Increasingly, I think there's 46 states now have very specific laws around disclosure when there's been a significant harm or some sort of measured harm to an individual in terms of their personal privacy. Canada, we're just passing new legislation affecting a law called PIPEDA, and that will also cause all organizations to at least have to disclose to the privacy commissioner, but also if there's any indication of significant harm and to be defined significant, they need to disclose that to customers as well. That is changing the dynamic because right away, it's about brand. It's about brand protection, and it's about your place in the marketplace. The other thing about insurance, though, which I think is really more of a game changer, is that what is the piece that's insured? Yes?
But kind of a counterpoint to that is, there isn't any attention on the renewal of the Patriot Act in 2015.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, I was watching This Week Tonight the other day, and there was a good discussion about that. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I'm finding it kind of interesting too, that sometimes we're very, almost like bipolar, I think, as society, the Canadian American societies, we're suddenly hot and bothered by something, and then suddenly we're distracted by the next shiny object. And there's very little discussion about really important changes. Renewals of the Patriot Act is a great example of that. We just passed new legislation, we're about to. Bill C-51 is Canada's new anti-terrorism act. It is draconian. And I'm a CT practitioner, and I testified in Parliament about that one as well, and I said, I love having, if I was back in the job, I would love to have that kind of toolbox. But as a citizen, I'm going, like this is serious shit. Like, this has got some incredibly important tools, and the impact on the individual is serious. Anyhow, long story short, this happened after the attack on Parliament Hill. You may have seen that back in October. One individual, a radicalized individual who was a convert to Islam, ends up running one day up on the cenotaph, which is kind of like our version of the of your sort of, I'm trying to think your place. No, where you have to bury your soldiers up Arlington Cemetery. It's kind of our sort of marker place right downtown across from Parliament Hill. And he shot a soldier dead. An unarmed soldier was standing there. And then he ran up on the hill, and then he got inside. And luckily, the House wasn't sitting, but there was a whole bunch of parliamentary committees going on, and it ends up being killed. That traumatized Canadians. This is somebody not only just taking an attack somewhere public, but really at your House of Legislation. This is like Capitol Hill. So as a result, the government, of course, in the election year, saw a great opportunity, and of course, then we moved very, very quickly to new legislation. That legislation is very useful, there's no doubt. I still believe most of it is very, very useful, but there's also some important pieces that need debate. Suddenly, so in the early days, I think it was 83% of Canadians were in favor of this thing. It's suddenly dropping quite a bit because people forget over time. We're only talking about a few months. And that suddenly, it's kind of a reverse factor. What you're talking about, but it speaks to the same problem. People are not engaged as much as they were at one point. On the insurance piece, though, let me just quickly say that ultimately, though, it's a question of, if you're going to be insured, a lot of companies are waking up to this, is that, what am I insured for exactly around cyber? And of course, insurance companies are saying, and I'm working with 3 different ones, saying, well, what's to us, in terms of us honoring the policy, what's your level of diligence? What's your reasonable level? How do we define that? And that's becoming a big part of the discussion. Companies are shifting quickly to sort of help define it themselves around what do we need to do to achieve a certain level of diligence around their responsibility piece. Reason why? This figure. This figure keeps on rising. The cost for remediation is extremely high, and it's getting higher. Quick thought, and I don't think the numbers would match up perfectly, but if, let's say, the Target store hack, which had 110 million credentials stolen or pieces of identifiable information to an individual, then that cost could be completely organizationally destroyed. And we may see the outcomes of things like that in very near term. So that is also another big driver around this awakening that's going to turn us away from the abyss. The quote I thought, which was really, really handy just the last couple of months, was essentially what I'm saying about insurance. Even the courts are siding right now with insurance companies saying, sorry, that policy did not cover that particular liability. So Sony Pictures, pay up. So let me now shift gears to an area that I think is really important to me, and this is back to my initial premise about technology versus the human factor, and one where technology is definitely the driving issue. It matters the most in a lot of ways, but getting it right, I think, is going to resolve around a couple of very simple things. And I'm a big fan of behavioral analytics now. I know it's kind of the new buzzword, but I think that is really where the sweet spot is. And it can be used, it's about advanced analytics, ingestion of large gobs of data in real time, and the ability to manage all that, parse it, and see where the problems are. But I do, as I suggested earlier, I do deeply believe that it's about people. And that involves around, I do this for some companies that help them around the awareness piece, the training, and the surveillance, and there has to be consequences. One of the companies I first started doing business with a few years ago, they had they're about creativity, about a $4 billion retail company, but it was around design. So they had zero HR policies. They had no way to manage the hiring and the firing, and nothing about the consequences around conduct and discipline. And of course, they had a few employees who were some of their foreign buyers run amok. So I came in and took a look at things and I said, listen, from my perspective, although I come from the other end of the spectrum, where I think I was polygraphed 5 times in the last 8 years before I left, probably for just cause. But there's a whole bunch of reasons why it happened. But anyhow, that aside, we had that end of the spectrum where everything's disclosed, financials and everything else. This company had nothing. I think there are far more companies in the Fortune 500 that had very little. And the consequence of not managing that effectively could cause you as great harm as an external threat in terms of the hacking moment. So part of the problem, back to technology though, is I'll shift back and forth between the two, is that, as we know, most organizations actually have all the data. They have everything they need to discover the threat. But where do they find it? Why? Because they're managing big data and they're not managing all that well. They're not managing it well from a business intelligence perspective, I can tell you that, and they're certainly not managing it well from a threat intelligence perspective at all. Secondly, as this Dutch World War II soldier, this is a real picture. This is an early signature, I guess you could call him. He was on the front line trying to pick up some sort of, it was for nighttime activities. But at the end of the day, and this has been, I think, from the analysis, the pathology from the cases such as Target Store and probably JP Morgan Chase, another good examples, that it wasn't because they weren't watching, it wasn't that they weren't spending lots of money, it wasn't that they weren't doing analytics around cyber defense, is that they were overwhelmed by the noise. And that is, of course, the most difficult thing for all of us to figure out, is where do you find that sweet spot of where the signal is versus all the drama and I think, again, the human factor, one thing that I was worried about in the counterterrorism realm was the perpetual distractor. And whether it was somebody that was run up against us, or the fact that we looked at a cell that was emerging of potential threat actors who we thought might or may not cause a very serious incident. And a couple times we were close to falling prey to the distractor as opposed to the real threat. Back to people though, it's this issue. And we all know it. We all do it. I bet you if everybody's very honest, and I said, who of you out there has ever kind of thought around things, especially I'm thinking this crowd who's highly skilled, and really when it comes down to things you could do or want to do, the only thing stopping you is your conscience. The problem though I want to suggest here is that this is not about malicious intent. This is about employees who just want to do their job. They just want to create wealth for their company, they want to succeed their objectives, and they want to be doing the things they're being paid to do. The problem is, of course, that quite often we have really ham-handed approaches to security. We deliver, we layer things on. One of my clients the other day, one of the women who was very senior, extremely intelligent person, she's the first person to say, I'm not a technical person, and on the weekend I get home, they changed all the security systems, and I spent the whole weekend on the phone. When I get back on Monday, I'll tell you, there's going to be, we're going to put everything back the way it was. And they're both wrong. Security people failed on their delivery of the new security investment, but of course the reaction she had was also equally wrong. So people will do what they need to do to get around the rules. And a lot of them being fairly superficial, it's not all that difficult. So they become the unwitting, quite often, accomplices to a cyber attack. But where there is a witting element, and we have this insider threat, I'm still always amazed by how many companies have access to or allow access to mobile devices, allow access to everything from USB keys to still burning CDs somewhere in the network. That to me is untenable, it's unsustainable, but it's still widely practiced. Why? Because of productivity. People want their data, they want to be able to move things around. We all know what 1 terabyte USB can do in terms of how much information can be stolen. Morgan Stanley fired one of their employees last year for taking 350,000 names and addresses and phone numbers, contact details of high net worth clients with him because eventually he was going to move on to a competitor. So one of the basics in life is that, again, I probably show my background all the time, but at the end of the day, it is about an intelligence cycle, which is really a cycle of life. It's everything how we manage our day-to-day existence, from buying groceries to take care of the kids, to getting ourselves to and from work. We have a requirement, we plan around it, we execute it, we learn from that, and then we figure out our next day and we move on, and it's a constant cycle of things. One of my young analysts came back from Afghanistan at one point and said, wow, I just lived the perfect intelligence cycle in an 18-hour period every day. Because it was a unique environment where essentially requirements came out of either the embassy there or the military, because we're doing support to military operations. They were working on it all through the night, going through the requirements, tasking out. Teams went out at dawn, debriefed sources, came back, did the reporting, sent out the stuff, did the follow-up, get the feedback from the intelligence piece, and then just churned it back into that cycle. He was absolutely amazed, because usually it's always very theoretical. But at the end of the day, the lesson out of that is we need to look at the threat and managing the threat around cyber inside the threat the same way an intelligence agency does. You need to think about it, you need to plan, and you need to execute effectively. So you, yourselves, and the things you do, of course, have to think and work and operate like int officers, like intelligence officers. And if you do, you're going to be far more successful, I would suggest, in terms of managing your requirements and going after the things you want to achieve with respect to your work. The other factor here is that being an intel officer, you value intelligence, and you value the sharing of intelligence and the quid pro quo aspect of all that. And the big thing here is applied threat intelligence. We've heard a lot about threat intelligence. It's another sort of buzzword of late. Often involves a lot of feeds, some of them very expensive services that people subscribe to. They get lots of stuff again. I think quite often there's too much of it, and not of it is high quality. But within that, though, there's a great opportunity to pull the right threads, and then to share those threads within your own sector, your own industry, within your own little structure of people, whoever are working together on a project, or hopefully further afield, because the threat actors also cluster their activities. And seeing patterns of behavior become more evident when people share. Goes back to my example of crowdsourcing. One thing I'd like to do too is remind my audiences, and I'm thinking more in terms of briefing corporations and stuff, is that it's all about environmental awareness. It's all about positioning. It's about understanding where you are in the context of the threat. Some companies overspend grossly because they suddenly go out and they tell the CIO, buy a bunch of appliances, stick them on the network, do this, do that, and don't bug me again. Or they really underestimate, and I think it's usually the latter. They usually greatly underestimate the threat against them. So what I'd like to do is sort of first and foremost do a threat risk assessment. Where do you sit on the threat in terms of what's the probability, the likelihood, what's the consequence piece, in terms of what is the worst thing that can happen. In some cases, you need to go big because you've got so many items in the red zone. In some cases, you don't. And I think that's one of those early pieces. It's just a little exercises, one of little SWOT things that everybody should do with respect to their own business or organization or mandate. The other part, though, is back to human beings. As much as I say there has to be policies, there has to be surveillance to some degree, and there has to be consequences. Yes, once in a while there will be a public flogging. And somebody will get a public spanking, and unfortunately that does work. The problem, of course, is that you never want to be part of an organization where nobody is trusted. I was part of that when I first started in the Cold War. When I first joined CSIS in 1984, we were in the heart of the Cold War. I was on a Soviet intelligence operations desk for a bit. And I'll tell you, at a 5-person desk, not one of us knew what the other was doing. Because in those days, we were obsessed with moles. We were obsessed with the idea that one of us was a mole. So, and unfortunately, that was part of the legacy of a guy from the CIA from the 60s and 70s, James A. Angleton, who basically perverted everybody's thinking around obsessions and destroyed careers and marriages and everything else. At the end of the day, as I used to joke quite often, we're such a good organization keeping secrets, not one good piece of intelligence ever leaves the building. So that's part of the problem. So you never want to be part of that organization, because if you want to fast track yourself to an insider threat, then you sow distrust within your corporate culture. And that will guarantee that somebody will feel that, why should I be loyal to you when you're not loyal to me? So getting that delicate balance, and I wrote a paper on that a little while ago, I think it was 2 years ago for an online screening magazine. It's a tough thing, but you must do it, you must do it well. So there has to be rules, but there has to be a balance. The other part too, which drives me crazy, is the issue of the drive to innovate. And of course, I was going to say one of the early examples, what's changing the landscape around innovation design and this gap around ingenuity versus policy and rules of engagement is, a lot of it's in private hands. So venture capital is driving so much of the innovation. And of course, what's driving innovation in the workplace is people. People want to have tools, they want the best and the latest. And of course, lots of pressure on CIOs to deliver that, keep the networks clean, get the latest devices rolled out, keep our place secure and do it on the same budget. The problem is, of course, too many things get rolled out before they're ready because of public pressure, I'll call it, within your organization. So I think there's responsible choices that must be made, and there has to be pushback by those who are helping to secure those networks. And then, of course, and this is something probably many of you practice, I'm a very firm believer in the same way in the human world, in terms of human intelligence, I talk to everybody. I talk to the enemy all the time. I would have more dialogue with Iran and North Korea through back channels because that's how you learn. And that's how you pick up, and that's how you influence and shape environments. It's the same for the internet. It's just a parallel universe. And the dark web offers that unique opportunity to go after that threat intelligence that's the best. Because that's where you're going to see where others are talking about you, talking about your firm, or talking about your client. And of course, there's the kill chain factor, but it's, again, you're all working now, I hope, thinking now as intelligence officers. It's the counterintelligence approach. You want to think about your target set, you want to learn as much as you can about them, and you want to create an environment where you will discover early, that you will be able to predict behavior, and you'll be able to make a decision point, whether it's to kill it or let it live, so that you can follow it back home or do whatever you need to do for attribution and so on. But ultimately, it's being smarter and thinking from a counterintelligence perspective. One of the last sort of things, I think, in terms of this turning point that I'm seeing happening a lot, and it happens, I work with an organization called Hill and Knowlton Strategies, and in that, we're very big on crisis management. That's one of the reasons it brought me in, is to combine my sort of thinking around threats with the fact of responses, including post-breach. As you've heard, I think, again, Comey, the FBI director, said it again, and a few others, there's only two kinds of organizations, those that have been hacked and those that don't know it. With that in mind, then of course any responsible organization has to have this front and center in terms of the way they think about things. So what I'm looking for in that is, of course, is an organizational-wide approach to risk. In other words, insider threat is part of the global risk register for the organization. It's not separate, it's all integrated, it's part of the holistic part of managing it. That there's always a challenge function. Again, my issue about complacency and the threat to life, the threat to institution, organization piece. And of course, frequent exercises, tabletops, drills, go back over it, lessons learned, churn that information back in that intelligence cycle. I've done some tabletops with clients with Hill and Knowlton, and I'm not sure that they're documenting the lessons learned and then driving that back into their response mechanism. And then finally, of course, is disclosure. What about the regulators? They're going to come knocking. What about law enforcement? That's also going to come knocking increasingly. What are the response mechanisms? How do you control that release of information without damaging the organization or hindering a lawful investigation? I'm going to close off with a couple things. The approach. I'm going to quote somebody who's the epitome of evil in my mind, but genius, because his take is really about subversion. So he's talking about counter-revolutionaries. So once we take power, I'll let you read the quote. The lesson learned out of that is who plays the false note, who plays the violin, who does the oboe, because I'll take it back, this is my last little thing I want to leave you with, is that, again, people over technology. Understand your threat environment. Think like an intel officer. Drive your intelligence collection piece in the same cycle of learned behavior. And focus on understanding who. Who is behind the threat is very, very important, stage one of the process. Because if you can figure that part, then it won't be that long before you can figure out a little bit, okay, if I understand who, I'm going to understand very shortly why they're doing it and what they're doing. Because those are very logical steps to understand human beings and the behavior behind those cyber threats. And then we're going to look towards shifting it as you start learning and your scale of knowledge grows, you're going to be becoming better at learning the how piece. So once you can figure out who, what, and what, how is not that far off in terms of what, how they're going to go after the things they want. Because I know what they want, I know who it is, I know why they're doing it, and then suddenly I'm going to get closer to the most important two last pieces of the puzzle is where. Where is that going to be? Like, is that a moment of merger and acquisition? Is it a moment of announcement of new IP, in terms of a new R&D success? Is it any number of things? And then that clue will lead you to the when, in terms of when's the most likely moment in time that they will engage in a threat-related activity against your organization. So I can leave you with that, and if you think of that way, I think it'll help you put all those pieces together and leave you with a better sense of, yeah, I think we're definitely in challenging times, but they're most interesting times. And I wouldn't want to be in any other place. And in fact, I want to thank you for what you do, because I don't think anybody could do more interesting and exciting work than this sort of cutting edge thing on the thing that matters most in the 21st century. So thank you very much. We have time for questions, Dave?
I think we have time for one question. So the first brave soul who raises their hand, it's Andrew Fisher. All right.
You again. Your slide about board-wide risk management, how does that go over? Because it seems to me that organizations today are particularly challenged because that risk is siloed, or management of that risk is siloed. And how do you, what do you tell people how to go and manage that?
Yeah, it's to, again, it's to sort of break down those traditional notional barriers around how organizations are supposed to be run. I think that's job one, in terms of making sure they understand that. And here's a quote from a CEO of Canadian Telco, which I thought was very, very smart, because it kind of nailed it for me, and I agree with exactly what he said, is whenever I have a client, if I run into a Canadian top 100 company CEO who says, listen, we need you guys to come in as our partner because the IT thing is a big thing for us to manage. And it's a big challenge for the organization. First thing I want to do is tell him or her that it is mine, you're an idiot. You are an IT organization. Everybody is an information-driven organization. It's part of the fabric, whether you're a very small two-person company or 20,000 employees. It's all about information technology. So looking at that, taking that as a starting point, then you have to understand that managing that, protecting it, is now beyond being siloed. There's no more, and I still run into it a little bit. One of the big banks in Canada, the CIO told me, or the chief technology officer, security technology officer told me that he's now responsible for all parts of security, including the physical piece. I said, good. To me, that's where you got to get. It has to be holistic, and you have to look at security as part and parcel. From now on, in the 21st century, security is part of the lexicon. And I hate to say it, it sounds like it's very self-serving, potentially, but ultimately it's about what's right for an organization, because there are so many types of threats. Many of them are nebulous, a lot of them are very low level. It's kind of low and slow, so you have to be constantly vigilant, constantly aware, but also not become a Nazi state within the organization. So make it just part of the business, as opposed to being the cops come in and do their thing. So I think that makes it much more palatable for everybody as well, and more successful.
Cool. Okay. Oh, we have another brave question here. I will give you the mic.
You said you do a lot of, or some work with crisis management. You talked about Sony. Obviously, we got a real technical crowd here, but it seems to me that Sony's crisis response was brilliant, where they took the hack, took advantage of the publicity. They went direct to streaming for the movie, and then in their quarterly earnings, they said there was no material impact to their earnings from the hack. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, how companies can mitigate damage to the non-technical means.
Yeah, for sure. I think that goes back to one of my last slides about crisis response is probably your best defense. I think they did a very good job on that. I think Forbes magazine did the same thing. They did a great job when they lost 1 million credentials to a hack. In fact, they ran the story of how every moment of the hack occurred, and even the people who made the mistakes. I think that's a great way to go. I mean, the Sony thing, I love it too. There's a deeper story to it. Of course, I used that little image of the interview because that's what people thought about. Right, it was Christmas time. So when that thing happened, it was very, very useful because when you get these little snippets of gossip around one of the execs says Angelina Jolie is just a marginal talent at best, it got everybody's attention, right? So at least that raised the level of awareness around cybersecurity and stuff. But it also, this was a distractor in my mind, is that ultimately, this is the real, I think, this is just my own pet theory, and I have no basis, so, whatever, this is Chatham House rules, I hope. I think the real gun to their head wasn't the release of the movie or some of the other manuscripts that were stolen, number of things. I think it was email. I think that the content of those emails, everybody's honest, right? But nobody wants to be audited. So we all do it through an organization. We spend a lot of time reminding people, be careful what you write, because one day somebody's going to read it. I can almost guarantee it. And of course, coming from the intelligence service that had lots of review, we knew, we told our officers, we drove it crazy. We used to have little lanyards for our passes that said rigor, 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 and everything you do. Don't make mistakes in terms of especially what you write and what you analyze. So as a result, I think that's really one thing that they couldn't control. And it's one thing that I like to remind companies that that is your worst nightmare. Of all the things that happen to you, the probably the thing that's least protected is your mail server. Because you're going to probably, your crown jewels, you're thinking it's the intellectual property, it's the financial transactions, the point of sale, whatever. I think your emails are the thing that's going to bite you the most. Because in that is a treasure trove. For malicious actors, whether they're looking to harm your brand reputation, or they're looking to perhaps engage in ransom and a few other things.